You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, now, Houston also officially, formally released their non-conference basketball schedule. Now, I think it's interesting to look at this because the Houston basketball program, unlike the football program is rebuilding. The basketball program is well established as a strong perennial program, right? This is not something that we're worried about how this is going to affect our ranking, as much as we want to make sure we're ready for the gauntlet that is Big 12 play. Houston's released the schedule, and they open with Jacksonville State on November 4th. They play Auburn at Toyota Center on November 9th. They have a couple of home games against the Raging Cajuns of Louisiana and against Hofstra, both in November. And then over the week of Thanksgiving, the end of November, they head to Las Vegas for the Players Era Tournament. Well, no, they'll at least play Alabama. They could also potentially play ranked preseason teams on the 45 list of Rothstein. You got Rutgers, A&M, Notre Dame, a handful of other powerful programs in that tournament. That's a big NIL deal. We've talked about a couple different times on this, but that's a big NIL deal for Houston and a great tournament to add in that window where everyone's playing non-conference tournaments. Houston returns from Vegas, and their first game back is December 7th against Butler. That's their Big 12 Big East showdown matchup. That game is in Fertitta on December 7th. They then have Troy, Toledo, and the Islanders of, I think that's A&M Corpus Christi. And I look at all that, and I think a lot of people say, oh, yeah, Troy, real tough, Parker. And I think that there's a couple things to balance here. One, they've got Auburn coming to Toyota. Auburn's been a tournament team the last couple of years, and obviously Locked On Auburn and Zach Blackbeard will tell you more themselves, and we'll hopefully get a crossover before that happens. But Auburn is looking at what might be one of their best teams in the last decade, if not longer, and that includes the year they had Jabari Smith, right? This is the kind of team at Auburn. They put together a big recruiting class coming in, combined with a big transfer portal class, and this is just Zach and I texting back and forth. They think this is a big-time team. That's a big test for them early, big test for Houston early, but that's the kind of win in early November that you could look back on in February, man, I can't believe Houston did that to them, right? It is Toyota. It is technically a neutral site. As you saw last year with A&M in the Halal Guys game. I remember in that game, it was Toyota, but it did feel like a split crowd. Now, A&M's different than Auburn. It's much closer, et cetera. But, there's a real chance that has a neutral court feel, even though it is in Houston, because Toyota is so big. And honestly, if you're living in Auburn, Alabama, why wouldn't you travel to Houston? Then also the factor in that Auburn's a private school and people live all over. They go, right? So, tough game out the gates at Auburn. Then you'll have the other scheduled game being Butler. Every year that you're going to get a Big East matchup in your non-conference schedule. You can't tell if it's going to be UConn or Butler or whomever, right? There's a chance you get, UConn, Marquette, the top seeds in the tournament, or Butler that's not necessarily the Butler of Gordon Hayward's days, but not a bad team either, right? So you schedule assuming that could be potentially anyone in the Big East, and you hope that the conference committees can line you where you're one of the stronger teams. I think Houston looks like getting with Butler. It's not going to be like Kansas, UConn or something. I don't know who the other teams have actually, but what you're hoping is that, that game when you're setting your schedule is going to be another game that's big for you. Butler's a good game for Houston. That's a very winnable game, but it's also not like a bad team by any stretch or measure. It should be another tournament team. Then the unscheduled or not for sure games are the ones in Las Vegas. We know Houston opens the Players Invitational Tournament with Alabama. Alabama was a Final Four team last year, right? That's as good a game on your resume as anyone could have, right? That's, before you get to the rest of that tournament, a really strong 3 games in the non-conference before you get into the gauntlet that is Big 12 play. And that's normal for the Big 12. I think a lot of people compare Houston and Kansas because they're both really, strong basketball programs at the present time. And both, frankly, Kansas is the blue blood. Houston's beating down the door to try and get to the next level and be a blue blood. They're very comparable programs in the present tense for sure. But outside of Kansas, Houston's going to have more challenging schedule as most teams in the Big 12. Most Big 12 teams spend their non-conference getting ready and staying healthy for the gauntlet that is the conference. And yes, that kept Oklahoma out of the NCAA tournament last year, but it's just the reality of being in the Big 12, right? People say, well, look at Kentucky, North Carolina, look at UCLA, and they point to these big historical blue blood programs. But the other part of that equation is they got a lot of big TV games, frankly, a lot of times against one another once they'd established themselves. That's why when we say Houston needs to continue to beat down the door and prove they are that caliber of program, because you and I both think they are, right? Once they get to that point, they'll get those invitations as well. The big thing I've been harping on is obviously the NIL Classic. This Players Invitational thing is great. Players Era Invitational thing is great. The other tournament I would look at Houston potentially getting in is this Jordan Brand Classic matchups where a bunch of Jordan schools are playing one another. Most Jordan Brand schools are good at basketball. Houston, as a Jordan Brand school, has not been, odd number of schools. Someone gets loved that Houston hasn't been in it, but you could get potentially a UCLA or a Michigan or a Florida, North Carolina, whomever. You also might just draw Georgetown, and they're not very good right now, right? But that is the only other thing I'd see adding to the schedule. Realistically, this is a schedule that has, again, recent Final Four caliber talent in Alabama, right? A team like Auburn, I'm telling you, in February, it's going to look like a good win, right? Butler is a good Big East team. You have these core staples in the schedule. And you also spend a lot of December with Troy Toledo and getting ready to go play the Big 12 and have last year's Big 12 was good, and you added Arizona. You added Utah, right? Like, this is going to be a challenging season. Not just because the exit is Jamal Shedd. I know Houston returns a ton of talent, and I'm telling you, you're going to like Milo Suzan too. Like, they're going to be really good. You want to be healthy, you're going to be strong, you're going to be playing your best basketball at the end of December when you transition into Big 12 play, and then playing better basketball than that when you get into March, right? We saw last year that the truth is the only thing that beat Houston was their own health. This is a schedule so to have tests, to have showcase, and to have things that will help us know how good this team is and help the nation know how good this team is, while hopefully also having spots to preserve that health that, frankly, has gotten in Houston's way for about 3 years in a row. And whenever Houston knocks on the door, and I think it could be this year, right? We'll get to Houston basketball talk when it's basketball season. Whenever Houston knocks down that door, the difference is going to be they stayed healthy. They kept everyone off the IR. There was no Shedd ankles. There was no Marcus Sasser groins. There were no shoulder injuries. That's going to be the big thing. And I'm telling you, the schedule sets up in a way that could help that out. Now,